I just want a couple little thank yous. I want to thank Coach House Press just for reissuing Jones's book, I think this year or a year ago or so. And I want to thank Bardia Sanai, who's been here before quite a bit. He turned me on to Jones, so I got this book from him and discovered Jones's work from Bardia. We actually did this Dead Poet reading on the radio last Thursday on Literary Landscapes on CKCU. You can hear us if you go to Odorless Press, by odorless.wordpress.com. There's a podcast version of it. It also features a bunch of Toronto punk music, sort of from the milieu that Jones was sort of immersed in. So you can hear that, and you can sort of, and also Barty did a great monologue in the style of Gian Gameshe about punk poetry and such. So I'm just going to open with a poem, the titular poem of The Brave Never Write Poetry. I have bookmarks, I should use them. The brave never write poetry. The brave ride streetcars to jobs early in the morning, have traffic accidents, rob banks. The brave have children, relationships, mortgages. The brave never write these things down in notebooks. The brave die and they are dead. It takes guts to watch television, get your hair done, have a barbecue. It takes guts to blow up the Canadian bomb factory and plead guilty to 25 years. Joseph Brodsky was exiled for his poetry, and now he lives in the land of the brave. They like his poetry there, but the brave don't read it, and in Moscow they are lined up in the streets to buy food. It takes guts to know some happiness and not make a poem of it. And alone in my room I am calling someone now, anyone. Someone give me the strength to be and not question being. Someone give me the strength to Someone give me the strength to stay out of the cafes and libraries. Someone give me the strength not to apply to the Canada Council for the Arts. Someone give me the strength not to write poetry. But nothing. No one. The streets have not exploded, the streetcars pass, the clock has moved another inch. Ernesto Cardenal will no longer write poetry while the U.S. makes war on his country. I read this in Playboy magazine. Later I stare at the image of a naked woman, her legs spread across the centerfold, and I know, as the semen runs into my hand, that she would never write poetry. It is springtime in Toronto. I am in love. So that's from The Brave Never Write Poetry. So Jones was not inducted into that infamous 27 club with Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin and Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse and all them, but it's hard not to pigeonhole the poet as sort of the James Dean of Canadian poetry. To get it out of the way, Jones only published one book of poetry, and he took his own life in 1994. Kevin Connolly called him the saddest person you've ever met times 10. Born in 1959 in Hamilton, Ontario, then a longtime resident of Toronto, Daniel Jones, or just Jones as he preferred for a time, was that Bukowski sort of poet who so many academic and nature poets I think simultaneously despise and wish they could be. Funny then that despite his reputation as l'enfant terrible de Toronto, the poet laureate of puking, he wanted to be a part of the larger Canadian poetry scene. In 1982, Jones scored a desk gig from the League of Canadian Poets, apparently because of his nice ass, and it gained him a window into the larger poetry scene. He discovered, by his own words, quote, "a massive and absurd mutual admiration society where poetry was nothing more than the currency that brought greater currency, grants, teaching positions, writer-in-residencies, government-financed writing tours, sex, and ever-elusive fame. Half of the poets had nothing to say and no particular skill in saying it. In a way, the quality of the poems was irrelevant. Most were," and just to note, I'm a public servant wannabe, "most were professors, instructors, and civil servants. They wanted two things, a career in poetry and as big a slice of the can-lit pie as they could lay their hands on. Canadian poetry had become a huge and corrupt bureaucracy. It was ugly, cynical, and full of pettiness and hatred. I loved it." End quote. So at 26, 3 years later, Jones put out his one and only book of poetry. Some poetry had appeared in magazines and chapbooks, but The Brave Never Write Poetry is the Jones poetry book. I should note here that Jones also wrote a couple of novels and a book of short stories, apparently so terse it was painful, but it's the poetry that I've read, so that's what you get tonight. And it's the poetry you get tonight because, from my experience, we don't have enough poets who could open for a concert. Ergo, the first poem I'll read is called, the second poem I'll read tonight is called Rock and Roll. So imagine dirty punk club, like Sneaky D's or something in Toronto in the early 80s. When I came to, I was sitting on a concrete shelf. It was the 52 drunk tank again, and I didn't even try to remember why. After a while, a cop unlocked the door. "Get your stuff and get out of here," he said. I signed for my belt and wallet. I had $1 left and I threw it on the counter. "Thanks for the service, I said. Though you should check your clientele. The man next to me was obviously drunk. I walked straight out onto Dundas. It was a sunny morning. I puked into a small blue garbage can. I had a reading to give that night and spent the day pacing my room. It was no good. I wouldn't make it. I tried to eat, but it came right up. I found a 20 and went up the street for a bottle. When it was dark, I grabbed the poems and got the streetcar. It was standing room only when I got there. You're on in 10 minutes, they told me, right after the first band. I found the bar and ordered several bottles of beer. There were a couple hundred people. They were dressed in leather, some had dyed Mohican haircuts. The band was playing and they were dancing. I swallowed a couple of Valium and drank a beer. Then it was quiet, and I heard my name over the PA, and several men in leather were leading me on stage. There were microphones everywhere. The lights were hot. I drained another beer and stood looking out at the darkness. Then I fell over. I fell onto one of the drum kits. A microphone fell on top of me. The darkness was silent. I stood up and walked over to a mic. "Now for the poems," I said. I could hear myself through the monitors. I started to read the poems. Silence. "Rock and roll," someone yelled. "Up yours," I yelled back. And then I read the poems through, and they shut up for a while, and it was over, and I made my way through the crowd. The local radio station wanted an interview. Strangers handed me beer. I found the back corner and took a long gulp. A young woman in tight jeans walked up to me. "I want to hug you," she said. She hugged me. "Please, don't keep drinking," she said. "Please, don't kill yourself." It was funny. I'd forgotten all about suicide. It wasn't for another 2 days that I slashed my wrists. So yeah, a sad man, but you can't help but undervalue the opportunity of misery. I know I sometimes sit in bed with my wife, beer on the nightstand, and think, what's there to say? And definitely Jones, who had more than his share of drama and depression, felt the same way. He concludes the poem, title unknown, quote, "Total blackness embraces the window. The glass trembles slightly. You are alone in this prison of stillness. You've written these lines many times before," end quote. Though this is balanced, though, by other poems, for instance, the conclusion of The Anti-Bourgeoisie, "There's a little more. I've got a bladder full of words. Don't stand in doorways." Now, Jones didn't have much tolerance, at least in his writing, for most people, professions, and politics, though this is definitely self-directed at times. He writes in May Day 1986, which I found on the internet, quote, "We came to read poems of revolution and love, but the workers couldn't make it. Maybe everyone had to work," Keith says to the 5 or 6 poets who have gathered. "Or maybe they're home resting with a beer," says Enzo, opening a beer. Connolly, who I should mention was a friend of Jones, said Canada doesn't have much love for its confessional poets. And as someone who's been called one myself, I think we confessors are ever more guarded than the rest. That for every revelation of deeds shameful, you know that there's one worst that didn't make the leap from paper to print. That the confession always seeks absolution, never admonition. Give him just enough to cover your tab, a 52-year-old zombie Jones might say. Anyways, I'm getting far too personal, but it's irresistible as a poet reading Jones not to want that brusque intimacy with him. More than one Jones poem ends with the word immortal. And at the end of this last poem I'll read, A Cold Ear of Corn, it appears maybe that Jones figured for a time that by making himself the key subject of his work, he could achieve something great. So this is A Cold Ear of Corn. Blackbirds filled the trees like insane fruits, the evening air dense and still. Young men and women formed lines across the playa and slowly promenaded, the elders watching silently. In the distance, the dark peak of Popocatépetl, 20 years old and lost in Cuernavaca, tired from a day's search for a ghost I didn't find. A long month alone in a strange country. I sat drinking tequila from the bottle, and Enrique sat down beside me. Our conversation was awkward. There were so few words we shared, but later we walked through the market, and Enrique bought me a postcard of the volcano to give to me, and I bought a cold ear of corn, and he ate half, and then laughed as I winced at the bitter taste of lime and chili. And later still, in the Hotel American, I stood looking from the door of my room at the chickens and parrots in the courtyard, and Enrique came up from behind and grasped my shoulders. And for the first time, I kissed another man, tasted his heavy tongue in my mouth, felt the down of his adolescent beard against my lips. Enrique's dark hands held my chest to the mattress as he rode my wanting cock, and I cried out and I was gone inside of him. But then I would not let him enter. "Ma grande," I protested, and holding his cock in my hand, I began to stroke until the semen shot onto my stomach, and he fell beside me and we slept. And in the morning, silently I dressed and rode the first bus out of Cuernavaca, and I was I was sick and confused, and when I came to the border of Guatemala, I took a new hotel and for 3 days drank. One night I fucked a prostitute, and many more days passed in idleness, drunk. Enrique, 6 years have passed as I write these words. I have slept with many women, lived with some, loved a few. But on many tired nights alone at my desk, in dozens of small rooms in the city of Toronto, the poetasters and their students staring over my shoulder, I have sat with memories of that night, and the poems have often been for you. I ask only that they might stab the dumb and sterile darkness hard as your cock, sometimes splattering small pearls here and there. Thank you.